Palmer Matthews had always believed that love conquered all. At 26, with her auburn hair catching the morning light streaming through the kitchen window of their colonial home in Westfield, Connecticut, she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone trying to hold everything together. The coffee maker gurgled to life as she laid out 2 matching blue plates, 2 napkins folded just so, and 2 glasses of fresh orange juice. Everything symmetrical. Everything perfect. Just like her marriage was supposed to be. "Blake, breakfast!" she called up the mahogany staircase, her voice echoing in the spacious foyer adorned with their wedding photos. 5 years of marriage smiled back at her from those silver frames. Palmer in flowing white, Blake Harrison Matthews in his navy suit, both of them radiant with the kind of happiness that made strangers at the grocery store comment on what a beautiful couple they made.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Blake appeared at the top of the stairs, his dark hair perfectly styled even at 7 in the morning, his 6-foot frame filling out his tailored business suit. He was handsome in that effortless way that had first caught Palmer's attention at the coffee shop near Boston University, where she'd been finishing her master's in social work, and he'd been charming everyone within earshot with stories about his marketing campaigns. "Smells amazing, sweetheart," he said, pecking her cheek as he reached for his coffee. But Palmer noticed something she'd been noticing more often lately. The kiss felt mechanical, like he was going through the motions rather than actually connecting with her. "We have that appointment with Dr. Richardson at 4 today," Palmer reminded him, watching his face carefully for any reaction. "Our 3rd session." Blake paused with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. For just a moment, something flickered across his features. Confusion? Irritation? But then his practiced smile returned. "Right, of course. Looking forward to it." Looking forward to it. Palmer almost laughed. 3 months ago, when she'd first suggested marriage counseling, Blake had fought her tooth and nail. "We don't need some stranger poking around in our business," he'd argued. "We can figure this out ourselves." But their arguments had been getting worse, more frequent, more vicious. The tender man who used to leave her sweet notes in her lunch had been replaced by someone distant, critical, and increasingly cruel. The final straw had come when Palmer found herself crying in the Target parking lot after Blake had berated her for embarrassing him in front of his colleagues at a company dinner. She'd simply asked him to introduce her to his new boss, something any wife might do. But Blake had later accused her of being clingy and desperate for attention. That night, as she lay in bed listening to him scroll through his phone beside her, Palmer had made the decision that would change everything. "We're going to counseling or we're getting divorced," she'd told him the next morning, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "I'm not living like this anymore." To her surprise, Blake had agreed almost immediately. Too immediately, Palmer thought now, stirring honey into her tea. The man who had resisted every suggestion she had made for improving their relationship had suddenly become the picture of cooperation. He'd even helped her research therapists, ultimately selecting Dr. Sarah Richardson, a well-regarded family therapist with offices in downtown Hartford. Their first session 2 weeks ago had been strange. Blake had been charming, articulate, and seemingly committed to working on their marriage. He'd acknowledged his shortcomings, apologized for his recent behavior, and even held Palmer's hand as they left the office. Palmer had felt hopeful for the first time in months. But then, the very next day, Blake had reverted to his cold, critical self. When Palmer had tried to discuss what they'd talked about in therapy, he'd looked at her blankly, as if he had no idea what she was referring to. "I said I'd try harder. What more do you want?" The second session had been even more confusing. Once again, Blake had been the perfect patient, insightful, vulnerable, committed to change. He'd even brought up specific issues they'd discussed the week before, demonstrating what Dr. Richardson had called remarkable progress in emotional awareness. But walking to the car afterward, Palmer had felt more confused than ever. The Blake in that office felt like a completely different person from the one she lived with. When she'd mentioned this to him that evening, he'd grown defensive. "Maybe I'm just more comfortable opening up in a professional setting," he said, not looking up from his laptop. "Isn't that the whole point of therapy?" Now, watching him scroll through emails while mechanically eating the scrambled eggs she'd made, Palmer felt that familiar knot in her stomach tighten. Something wasn't right. She couldn't put her finger on it, but her instincts, the same instincts that had helped her succeed as a family counselor herself at the Westfield Community Center, were screaming that something was very, very wrong. "I was thinking maybe we could grab dinner after therapy today? That little Italian place you used to love?"
Blake glanced up, and again Palmer caught that flicker of something. Uncertainty? Before his mask slipped back into place. "Sure, whatever you want." Whatever you want. The old Blake would have had an opinion, a preference. He'd have either enthusiastically agreed or suggested somewhere else entirely. This bland acquiescence felt almost worse than his recent coldness. Palmer's phone buzzed with a text from her best friend and colleague, Maria Santos. "Coffee before work? You sounded stressed yesterday." Palmer glanced at Blake, who was already gathering his things to leave. They used to coordinate their schedules, share their daily plans, exist in the comfortable rhythm of two lives intertwined. Now they moved around each other like polite strangers sharing space. "I'll see you at the office," Blake said, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. The morning ritual that had once included lingering kisses and whispered promises to call each other during the day now ended with a perfunctory goodbye. "Blake?" Palmer called as he reached for the door handle. He turned, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes that looked almost like panic. "I love you." The words hung in the air between them. Blake's face softened, and when he smiled, it was the first genuine expression she'd seen from him in weeks. "I love you too, Palmer, more than you know." And then he was gone, leaving Palmer standing in their perfect kitchen with its perfect breakfast dishes and its perfect facade, wondering why those words, the same words they'd exchanged thousands of times, had sounded like both a promise and an apology. As Palmer cleaned up the breakfast dishes, her mind wandered to her work at the community center. Just yesterday, she'd counseled a teenager whose parents had been so focused on appearing like the perfect family that they'd missed all the signs of their daughter's depression. Palmer prided herself on reading between the lines, on seeing what people tried to hide. It's what made her good at her job. So why couldn't she figure out what was happening in her own marriage? The house felt too quiet after Blake left, filled with the kind of silence that seemed to whisper secrets. She found herself walking through the rooms they decorated together, touching objects that told the story of their relationship. The throw pillow from their honeymoon in Napa, the coffee table book about architecture that Blake had bought during his brief obsession with home renovation, the framed photo from last Christmas where they both looked happy but somehow distant. Her phone rang, startling her from her reverie. The caller ID showed Blake's office number. "Palmer? It's Jennifer, Blake's assistant. Is everything okay? Blake just called in sick, but he seemed fine when he left the house this morning." Palmer's blood chilled. "He called in sick? When?" "About 20 minutes ago. He said he wasn't feeling well and would be working from home today. I just wanted to make sure he was all right." Palmer's hands began to shake. Blake had left for the office 30 minutes ago. She'd watched him drive away in his silver BMW, dressed for work, carrying his laptop bag. I'm sure he's fine," Palmer managed. "Probably just decided to work from home. You know how he is about not spreading germs around the office." But as she hung up the phone, Palmer's heart was racing. Where was her husband? And more importantly, who was the man who had been sitting across from her at breakfast, lying to her face? The perfect morning light that had seemed so hopeful earlier now cast long, suspicious shadows across the kitchen floor. Palmer sank into one of their matching chairs, staring at the second coffee cup Blake had left behind, still half full, still warm, still evidence of a conversation with a man who apparently wasn't who she thought he was. For the first time in their 5-year marriage, Palmer Matthews felt truly afraid. Not of Blake, but of the growing certainty that she might not know Blake at all. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Palmer's hands trembled as she gripped her coffee cup, the warmth doing nothing to chase away the chill that had settled in her bones. Blake's assistant's words echoed in her mind. He called in sick about 20 minutes ago. But Blake had left for the office 45 minutes ago, perfectly healthy, perfectly dressed for another day at Morrison & Associates marketing firm. The rational part of Palmer's mind, the part trained in crisis counseling and behavioral analysis, tried to find logical explanations. Maybe Blake had felt sick on the drive and pulled over. Maybe he decided to work from a cafe and hadn't wanted to explain. Maybe Jennifer had gotten the timing wrong. But Palmer knew Jennifer Walsh well. Blake's assistant was meticulous, organized, and had been managing Blake's schedule for 3 years. She didn't make mistakes about phone calls. Palmer pulled out her cell phone and scrolled to Blake's number. Her finger hovered over the call button. What would she say? "Hey, honey, your assistant called to check on you since you called in sick, but I watched you leave for work this morning." The accusation felt too large, too impossible. Instead, she texted, "Hope you're feeling better. Jennifer mentioned you weren't well?" While waiting for a response, Palmer found herself walking through their house with new eyes. This wasn't the first time lately that she'd felt like she was living with a stranger, but she'd attributed it to the stress they'd both been under. Blake's promotion to senior marketing director 6 months ago had meant longer hours, more pressure, more business trips. Palmer had been understanding, supportive even, taking on more of the household responsibilities while Blake adjusted to his new role. But now, standing in Blake's home office, Palmer noticed things she'd overlooked before. The desk was perfectly organized. Too organized. Blake had always been neat, but this level of precision was almost military. Every pen in its holder, every document filed exactly, every surface spotless. When had he become so obsessively orderly? Her phone buzzed. Blake's response: "Just a headache. Working from home today. See you at therapy." Palmer stared at the text. Blake never got headaches. In 5 years of marriage, she could count on one hand the number of times he'd called in sick. And his writing style felt different, too formal. Blake usually texted in fragments: headache, staying home, therapy later. This felt like someone trying too hard to sound like him. The thought that flickered through Palmer's mind was so absurd she almost laughed. Almost. But as a counselor who worked with troubled families, Palmer had learned to trust her instincts, no matter how unlikely they seemed. She called her supervisor at the Westfield Community Center. "Michelle, it's Palmer. I need to take a personal day. Family emergency." Michelle Rodriguez had been Palmer's mentor since she'd started at the center 3 years ago. A woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an uncanny ability to read people. She'd helped Palmer develop the skills that made her one of their most effective family counselors. "Everything all right?" Michelle's concern was immediate and genuine. Palmer hesitated. How could she explain suspicions she barely understood herself? I think my husband might not be who I think he is." The words sounded crazy even to her own ears, but Michelle didn't dismiss them. "Palmer, you have the best instincts of anyone I've ever worked with. If something feels wrong, it probably is. What do you need?" Time to figure out what's happening, and maybe some advice on how to research someone you thought you knew completely. There was a pause. "Come in around lunch. We'll talk." After hanging up, Palmer made a decision that felt both rational and completely insane. She was going to follow Blake. If he was really homesick, she'd find him here and could put her fears to rest. If he wasn't, well, she'd deal with that when it happened. Palmer grabbed her keys and headed for her Honda CR-V, but as she backed out of the driveway, a silver BMW exactly like Blake's passed her going in the opposite direction. The driver wore sunglasses, but Palmer caught a glimpse of dark hair and a familiar jawline. Her heart hammered as she made a quick U-turn, following the BMW at a distance. The car turned left on Maple Street, heading toward downtown Westfield, but instead of continuing toward Hartford where Blake's office was located, it pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Park. Palmer parked across the street, her hands shaking as she watched a man who looked exactly like her husband get out of the car. He was wearing jeans and a gray sweater, clothes she'd never seen before. Blake owned exactly 3 pairs of jeans, all dark wash, all hanging in the closet she organized every week. This pair was lighter, more worn. The man walked to a bench overlooking the Connecticut River, pulled out a phone, and made a call. Even from this distance, Palmer could see the tension in his shoulders, the agitated way he ran his fingers through his hair. Blake did that when he was stressed, but this gesture seemed more dramatic, more pronounced.
Palmer's phone rang, making her jump. Blake's name appeared on the screen. "Hello?" she answered, watching the man on the bench. "Hey, sweetheart, how's your day going?" The voice was Blake's, but the man by the river wasn't moving his lips. Palmer's world tilted. "Blake, where are you? Home, remember? Fighting this headache? Actually, I was thinking about canceling therapy today." The man by the river stood up, pacing now, clearly agitated about something. Palmer could see him perfectly, could see that he wasn't on a phone call. "No," Palmer said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "We need to keep the appointment. Dr. Richardson is expecting us." A pause. "Of course. You're right. 4 o'clock?" 4 o'clock, Palmer confirmed, hanging up. She sat in her car, staring at the man by the river, who looked exactly like her husband, but wasn't the person she'd just spoken to on the phone. The impossible truth was starting to take shape in her mind, but she needed proof. She needed to understand what was happening before she completely lost her sanity. Palmer drove to the Westfield Public Library, a massive brick building where she'd spent countless hours during graduate school. The research librarian, Mrs. Chen, remembered her from her thesis days and was happy to help Palmer access genealogy databases and public records. "I'm trying to research my husband's family history," Palmer explained, which was technically true. "Specifically, I want to know if he has any siblings." What Palmer found in the next 2 hours changed everything she thought she knew about Blake Harrison Matthews. According to birth records from Stanford Hospital, Blake Harrison Matthews had been born on March 15, 1991. But according to the same records, so had Brendan Harrison Matthews, twin boys born 3 minutes apart to Robert and Linda Matthews. Palmer's hands shook as she scrolled through more records. Both boys had attended Stanford Elementary School through 3rd grade. Then, abruptly, only Blake's records continued. Brendan seemed to have vanished from all official documentation after age 8. But Palmer's counseling background had taught her that people didn't just vanish, especially not children. She expanded her search, looking for any mention of Brendan Matthews in local news archives, missing person reports, anything that might explain his disappearance from public records. What she found made her blood run cold. A newspaper article from the Stanford Advocate dated 12 years ago. "Local teen dies in motorcycle accident." The photo showed a young man who looked exactly like Blake, but the caption read, "Brendan Matthews, 17, died Tuesday evening after losing control of his motorcycle on Route 95. Palmer stared at the screen, her mind reeling. According to this article, Blake's twin brother had died when they were 17. But if Brendan was dead, who was the man she'd seen at the park? And more importantly, which twin had she married? Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop looking into things you don't understand. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." Palmer's blood turned to ice. Someone was watching her. Someone knew what she was discovering. She looked around the library's computer section, suddenly hyper-aware of every person within sight. An older man reading a newspaper, a college student with headphones, a woman helping her young daughter with homework. None of them seemed threatening, but Palmer no longer trusted her ability to read people correctly. Another text arrived. "Go home, Palmer. Forget what you saw today. Your marriage depends on it." Palmer screenshot both messages, her counseling training kicking in. Document everything. Trust no one. Get help. She drove home with her doors locked and her phone ready to call 911, but when she pulled into her driveway, Blake's BMW was there, the same car she'd seen at the park, now sitting in the garage as if it had never left. Palmer sat in her own car for several minutes, gathering courage. She had to go inside. She had to face whatever version of Blake was waiting for her. She had to figure out if she'd married the right twin or if her entire marriage was built on a lie that started with a death that maybe never happened at all. As she walked to the front door, Palmer realized that in less than 3 hours, she would be sitting in Dr. Richardson's office with a man who might not be her husband. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she wondered if the therapist already knew the truth. The stakes had never been higher, and Palmer was running out of time to figure out who she could trust in a world where even her own husband's identity was in question.
Palmer's key trembled in the lock as she stood on her own front porch, afraid to enter her own home. The familiar sound of the deadbolt clicking open felt ominous now, like she was crossing a threshold into enemy territory. The house that had been her sanctuary for 5 years suddenly felt like a trap. "Blake?" she called softly as she stepped into the foyer, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the kitchen," came the reply, and Palmer's heart lurched. The voice was definitely Blake's, but after everything she'd discovered, even that certainty felt unreliable. She found him sitting at their breakfast table, laptop open, papers spread around him in organized piles. He looked up with a smile that seemed genuine, concerned. "Hey, sweetheart, you look pale. Everything okay?" Palmer studied his face, searching for some tell, some sign that would reveal which version of Blake this was. He was wearing the same business shirt he'd left in that morning, though he'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves. His hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place. This was the Blake she'd said goodbye to hours ago, not the casually dressed man she'd seen at the park. "I'm fine," she lied, settling into the chair across from him. "How's your headache?" Blake touched his temple absently. "Better, thanks. I think working from home was the right call." He gestured to his laptop screen. "Just finishing up the Morrison campaign proposal. You know how demanding they can be." Palmer nodded, but something nagged at her. Blake had been working on the Morrison campaign for months, and she'd never heard him describe the clients as demanding. In fact, he'd always spoken positively about them, calling them visionary and collaborative. "What time did you get home?" she asked casually, pretending to flip through the mail. "Get home? I never left, remember? I called in sick right after you left this morning." The lie hit Palmer like a physical blow. She'd watched him drive away. She'd followed a car identical to his to the park. Someone was lying, and the careful, methodical way Blake was maintaining eye contact while he spoke suggested years of practice at deception. "Actually," Palmer said, making a decision that terrified her, "I drove by the office around noon. Your car wasn't in the parking lot." Blake's expression didn't change, but Palmer caught the slightest pause before he responded. "That's impossible. I've been here all day." He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch warm and familiar. "Palmer, are you feeling all right? You seem off today." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment Palmer almost doubted herself. This was Blake's specialty, making her question her own perceptions, her own memories. But her counseling training had taught her to recognize manipulation tactics, and she was seeing them clearly now. "Maybe I was mistaken," she said, squeezing his hand. "I'm probably just nervous about therapy today." Blake's relief was almost imperceptible, but Palmer caught it. "Right, therapy. Actually, I've been thinking about what we discussed last week. Dr. Richardson's suggestions about communication patterns." Palmer's blood chilled. Last week, Dr. Richardson had focused entirely on trust issues and emotional vulnerability. They hadn't discussed communication patterns at all. Either Blake was confusing their sessions with someone else's, or he hadn't been there. "Remind me exactly what she said?" Palmer kept her voice light, curious rather than suspicious. Blake's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on hers. "You know, about using I statements instead of you statements. How we should focus on expressing our own feelings rather than making accusations." It was textbook marriage counseling advice, the kind of thing any therapist might say. But Dr. Richardson had a very specific style, focusing on behavioral patterns and subconscious triggers. Palmer had chosen her specifically because of her unique approach to therapy, which combined traditional counseling with behavioral analysis. "Of course," Palmer said. "That makes perfect sense." Blake smiled and released her hand, returning to his laptop. Palmer excused herself and went upstairs, her mind racing. In the privacy of their bedroom, she pulled out her phone and called Dr. Richardson's office. "Dr. Richardson's office? This is Amanda speaking." "Hi, Amanda. This is Palmer Matthews. I have an appointment with Dr. Richardson at 4 today, and I wanted to confirm something about last week's session." "Of course, Mrs. Matthews. How can I help you?" "Did my husband mention anything about communication patterns during our last visit? I'm trying to remember the specific advice Dr. Richardson gave us."
There was a pause, and Palmer could hear papers rustling. "Let me check the session notes." "Actually, Mrs. Matthews, according to Dr. Richardson's notes, your husband was quite focused on discussing trust issues and childhood trauma. The communication patterns discussion was scheduled for this week's session." Palmer's legs gave out, and she sank onto the edge of the bed. "Thank you, Amanda. That's very helpful." After hanging up, Palmer sat in stunned silence. Blake had just described therapy advice that hadn't been given yet. Either he was psychic, or he hadn't been in that room last week. But if Blake hadn't been in therapy, who had been sitting next to her, holding her hand, making promises to work on their marriage? Palmer's phone buzzed with another unknown number. "You're asking too many questions. Stop now, or face the consequences." This time, Palmer didn't hesitate. She immediately called the Westfield Police Department. "This is Officer Martinez. How can I help you?" "I'd like to report threatening text messages, and I think someone might be impersonating my husband." Even as she said it, Palmer realized how insane it sounded. But Officer Martinez was professional and thorough, asking detailed questions about the messages and the timeline of events. "Mrs. Matthews, I need to ask, is there any chance your husband has an identical twin?" The question hit Palmer like lightning. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, but he's supposed to be dead." "Ma'am, I think you need to come in and file a formal report. Can you be here within the hour?" Palmer agreed, but as she hung up, she heard Blake's footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, purposeful, different from his usual light tread. "Palmer, everything all right up there?" She quickly deleted the call log and slipped her phone into her pocket. "Just getting ready for therapy." When Blake appeared in the doorway, Palmer noticed something that made her stomach clench. Her shirt, which had been wrinkled from a day of work when she'd seen him in the kitchen, was now freshly pressed. His hair, previously slightly mussed, was perfectly styled again. "You changed clothes," she observed. Blake looked down at himself with what seemed like genuine surprise. "Did I? I don't remember. Maybe I spilled coffee on myself earlier." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ready to head to Dr. Richardson's?" Palmer nodded, grabbing her purse. As they walked downstairs together, Palmer noticed Blake moving differently, more confidently, with longer strides. Even his posture seemed subtly altered. In the car, Palmer made small talk, while secretly studying the man beside her. Everything about him was familiar, yet wrong, like a photograph that was just slightly out of focus. When he reached for the radio, she noticed his hands. Blake always kept his nails meticulously trimmed, but these were slightly longer. When he adjusted the rearview mirror, she saw that his watch was on his right wrist instead of his left. Blake was left-handed. He'd always worn his watch on his right wrist. This man was wearing it on his left. Palmer's mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. If Blake had a living twin who was impersonating him, how long had this been going on? Days? Weeks? Months? Had she been intimate with a stranger? Had she shared her deepest secrets with someone who was systematically deceiving her? And where was the real Blake? As they pulled into Dr. Richardson's parking lot, Palmer made a decision that would change everything. She was going to test this man claiming to be her husband. She was going to ask Dr. Richardson to help her figure out the truth. But first, she had to survive the next hour sitting in a small room with a man who might be dangerous, who might be capable of anything, and who had somehow managed to infiltrate her life so completely that even she couldn't tell the difference. "Palmer," the man beside her said softly, and his voice was perfectly Blake's that it made her heart ache. "I love you. Whatever happens in there, remember that I love you." Palmer looked into eyes that were exactly the right shade of brown, in a face that was precisely the one she'd fallen in love with 7 years ago. But behind those familiar features, she sensed something else entirely. A stranger who had been studying her, learning her, preparing for this moment when she would finally discover the truth. "I love you too," she replied, and meant it, even as she prepared to find out which version of love had been real, and which was the most elaborate deception of her life. Dr. Sarah Richardson's office was designed to put people at ease. Soft lighting, comfortable leather chairs arranged in a triangle, abstract paintings in calming blues and greens. But as Palmer settled into her usual spot, the familiar space felt like a stage set for a performance she wasn't sure she wanted to witness. Dr. Richardson was in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun and intelligent green eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She'd built her reputation on reading micro-expressions and detecting deception, skills that had made her invaluable in high-conflict divorce cases and custody battles. If anyone could spot an imposter, it would be her. "Good afternoon, Palmer, Blake," Dr. Richardson said warmly, settling into her chair with a leather portfolio balanced on her lap. "How has everyone been since our last session?" Palmer watched the man beside her, the man claiming to be Blake, carefully. He smiled confidently, leaning back in his chair with an ease that seemed almost theatrical. "Much better, actually. I've been thinking a lot about what we discussed last week. The trust exercises you suggested have been really helpful." Palmer's heart hammered. Dr. Richardson hadn't suggested any trust exercises. According to her notes, last week's session had focused entirely on childhood influences and emotional patterns. Dr. Richardson's pen paused almost imperceptibly above her notepad. "I'm glad to hear that. Could you be more specific about which exercises you found most beneficial?" Palmer held her breath. This was it, the moment that would either confirm her suspicions or prove she was losing her mind. "Well," the fake Blake said smoothly, "the communication mirroring technique, where we repeat back what the other person says before responding, and the gratitude sharing, writing down 3 things we appreciate about each other every day." Palmer watched Dr. Richardson's face carefully. The therapist's expression remained neutral, but Palmer caught the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her fingers gripped her pen just a fraction tighter. "Those are certainly valuable techniques," Dr. Richardson said carefully. "Palmer, how have you found these exercises?" Palmer realized this was her moment. She could play along, maintain the charade, and try to figure out the truth on her own, or she could trust Dr. Richardson's expertise and take a leap of faith. "Actually, Dr. Richardson, I'm a bit confused. I don't remember you suggesting those specific exercises last week." The silence that followed was electric. Palmer could feel the fake Blake's attention laser focus on her, but she kept her eyes on Dr. Richardson, who was now studying both of them with obvious interest. "That's an interesting discrepancy," Dr. Richardson said slowly. "Blake, can you help us understand this confusion?" For the first time since Palmer had confronted him, the fake Blake seemed genuinely rattled. She watched a series of micro-expressions flash across his face: surprise, calculation, then a forced return to confidence. "Memory can be tricky," he said with a laugh that sounded rehearsed. "Maybe I'm thinking of techniques I read about online. You know how it is. When you're motivated to improve your marriage, you start consuming a lot of self-help material." Dr. Richardson nodded thoughtfully, but Palmer noticed she was taking extensive notes now, her pen moving rapidly across the page. "Blake, I'd like to try something different today. I'm going to show you some images, and I want you to tell me the first word that comes to mind. It's a free association exercise that can help us understand your current emotional state." Palmer watched as Dr. Richardson pulled out some images, standard psychological assessment tools that Palmer recognized from her own training. She'd never seen Dr. Richardson use them before. Their sessions had always been more conversational. The first card showed a simple house. "Home," the fake Blake said immediately. The second card showed 2 figures. "Partnership." The third card showed a single figure standing apart from a group.
Palmer watched the fake Blake's face carefully. For just a moment, his mask slipped, and she saw something that looked like loneliness, desperation even. Isolation, he said quietly, and for the first time, his voice carried genuine emotion. Dr. Richardson made a note and moved to the fourth card, a mirror. The fake Blake stared at that longer than the others, and Palmer saw his hands clench slightly in his lap. Reflection, he said finally, but his voice was strained. Thank you, Blake. Palmer, could you step outside with me for a moment? I'd like to discuss your individual assessment results from last week. Palmer's heart leapt. They hadn't done any individual assessments last week, but Dr. Richardson was clearly creating an opportunity to speak privately. Of course, Palmer said, rising from her chair. The fake Blake started to stand as well, but Dr. Richardson held up a gentle hand. Just Palmer for now, Blake. We'll be right back. In the hallway outside Dr. Richardson's office, Palmer's words came out in a rush. That's not my husband. I know how crazy that sounds, but I've been married to Blake for 5 years, and that man in there isn't him.
Dr. Richardson's expression was grave, but not disbelieving. Palmer, I need you to know that I've been concerned about Blake's behavior for the past 2 sessions. His responses have been inconsistent with his previous patterns, and his body language has changed significantly. Palmer's relief was overwhelming. You noticed too? I've been practicing behavioral analysis for 20 years. When someone's core personality shifts as dramatically as Blake's has, it raises red flags. Dr. Richardson paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. Palmer, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Is there any possibility that Blake has a twin brother? Palmer's knees nearly buckled. How did you know? Identical twins often share mannerisms, speech patterns, even personality traits. That they also have distinct differences, subtle variations in body language, eye contact patterns, stress responses. What I'm seeing in there is someone who knows Blake very well, but isn't Blake. Palmer quickly filled Dr. Richardson in on everything she'd discovered, the conflicting stories about being homesick, the research about Brendan's supposed death, the threatening text messages. Dr. Richardson listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When Palmer finished, the therapist was quiet for a long moment. Palmer, this is a very dangerous situation. If someone has been impersonating your husband, and if they're threatening you to keep quiet, we need to involve law enforcement immediately. I already called the police, but they want me to come in and file a formal report. I was hoping to get through the session first, to gather more evidence. Dr. Richardson nodded. I'm going to help you do exactly that. When we go back in, I'm going to conduct what's called a biographical consistency test. I'll ask questions about your shared history that only the real Blake would know. But Palmer, I need you to promise me something. If I give you a signal, any signal that suggests we're in danger, you leave immediately. Don't worry about me, just get out and call 911. Palmer agreed, though the thought of leaving Dr. Richardson alone with a potentially dangerous imposter made her stomach clench. When they returned to the office, the fake Blake was sitting exactly where they'd left him, but Palmer noticed he'd been sweating. Small beads of perspiration dotted his forehead, despite the office's comfortable temperature. Sorry about that, said Dr. Richardson smoothly, settling back into her chair. Now, I'd like to try a different approach. Blake, I want you to take you through some memory exercises, shared experiences that can help couples reconnect with positive aspects of their relationship. Palmer watched as Dr. Richardson began asking increasingly specific questions about their dating history, their wedding, their early years of marriage. The fake Blake answered confidently at first, but Palmer noticed he relied heavily on general details rather than specific memories. When Dr. Richardson asked about their honeymoon in Napa Valley, he described wine tastings and romantic dinners, generic activities any couple might have done. But he couldn't remember the name of the small bed and breakfast where they'd stayed, couldn't recall the funny story about the innkeeper's cat that had knocked over an entire tray of wine glasses. Most tellingly, When Dr. Richardson asked about Palmer's family, he mentioned her parents but completely forgot about her younger sister Emma, who was in their wedding party and visited regularly. With each question, Palmer watched the fake Blake's confidence erode. His answers became more vague, his body language more defensive. Sweat stains appeared under his arms, and he kept glancing toward the door as if calculating escape routes. Dr. Richardson, meanwhile, was documenting everything with the precision of a detective. Palmer realized that her therapist wasn't just helping her gather evidence, she was building a case that could be used in court. As the session neared its end, Palmer felt a mixture of vindication and terror. Her suspicions had been confirmed by a professional, but that meant she was living with a stranger who had been deceiving her for an unknown period of time. The man sitting next to her had been in her home, in her bed, privy to her most intimate thoughts and vulnerabilities. "I think we've made excellent progress today," Dr. Richardson said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Same time next week?" The fake Blake nodded quickly, clearly eager to leave. When they gathered their things, Palmer caught Dr. Richardson's eye. The therapist gave her an almost imperceptible nod, a signal that they now had what they needed to take action. Walking to the car with the imposter, Palmer felt like she was walking with a ticking bomb. He knew she suspected something now. The question was, what would he do about it?
The car ride home from Dr. Richardson's office was suffocating. Palmer sat rigid in the passenger seat, hyper-aware of every movement the man beside her made. He drove exactly like Blake, same cautious speed, same habit of checking mirrors frequently, but she could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a furnace. "That was intense," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. Dr. Richardson seemed different today, more probing. Palmer kept her eyes fixed on the passing Connecticut suburbs, afraid that looking at him would betray the terror coursing through her veins. "She's thorough. That's why we chose her." "Right." A pause. "Palmer, can I ask you something? Do you feel like we're making progress in our marriage? I mean..." The question was so loaded with subtext that Palmer felt like screaming. Instead, she managed a non-committal hum. "I think we're learning a lot about each other." When they pulled into their driveway, Palmer noticed a black sedan parked across the street that hadn't been there when they left. The windows were tinted and she couldn't see inside, but something about its presence made her skin crawl. "Expecting anyone?" the fake Blake asked, following her gaze. "No," Palmer said, fumbling with her seatbelt. "Probably just someone visiting the Hendersons." But as they walked toward their front door, Palmer caught a glimpse of movement behind the sedan's windshield. Someone was watching them. Inside the house, the fake Blake went immediately to his office, claiming he had emails to catch up on. Palmer used the opportunity to call Dr. Richardson from the kitchen, keeping her voice low. "It's Palmer. We just got home, and there's a suspicious car watching our house." "Palmer, listen to me carefully." Dr. Richardson's voice was urgent. "I've been making some calls since you left. I contacted a colleague who specializes in identity fraud cases, and what you're describing fits a pattern we've seen before. Twin substitution schemes are rare but not unheard of, especially when there's significant financial motivation." Palmer's blood chilled. "Financial motivation? Have you noticed any unusual financial activity? Large withdrawals, new accounts, insurance policy changes?" Palmer's mind raced. Blake had handled most of their finances since his promotion, claiming it was easier to have one person managing everything. She'd been so busy with work and their marital problems that she'd stopped paying attention to their bank statements. I don't know. Blake took over the finances months ago." "Palmer, you need to check your accounts immediately, and whatever you do, don't let him know you're investigating. I'm calling Detective Susan Walsh at Hartford PD. She specializes in these cases. Can you safely get to the police station tonight?" Palmer glanced toward Blake's office, where she could hear him on what sounded like an urgent phone call. His voice was hushed, but she caught fragments. "She knows something, and we need to move faster." "I'll try," Palmer whispered, ending the call. Moving as quietly as possible, Palmer crept upstairs to their bedroom and opened her laptop. Her hands shook as she logged into their joint checking account, an account she hadn't looked at in over 2 months. What she found made her stomach drop. Over the past 6 weeks, there had been systematic withdrawals totaling nearly $30,000. Money transferred to accounts she didn't recognize. Cashier's checks made out to names she'd never heard of. Their savings account, which had contained over $50,000 from Blake's signing bonus, now showed a balance of just under $8,000. Palmer screenshot everything, her heart hammering as she documented the theft of their entire financial security. But it was the insurance document she found in their shared email that made her truly terrified. Blake had increased his life insurance policy from $100,000 to $500,000 just 3 weeks ago. The beneficiary was listed as Palmer Matthews, but there was a secondary beneficiary she'd never seen before. Brendan Matthews, the dead brother who apparently wasn't dead. Palmer's phone buzzed with yet another unknown number. "Stop digging or your husband dies. We have Blake. Play along or you'll never see him again." This message was different from the previous threats. This one was telling her not to forget what she discovered. It was telling her that the real Blake was being held somewhere, and her behavior was determining whether he lived or died. Palmer's vision blurred with tears. For weeks, she'd been angry at Blake for his coldness, his distance, his cruel comments. But if he'd been replaced by his twin during that time, then the real Blake had been, what, kidnapped? Imprisoned? While she'd been sleeping next to a stranger who was systematically stealing their money and planning God knows what. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made Palmer frantically close her laptop and wipe her eyes. The fake Blake appeared in the doorway, and for the first time she noticed how different his smile looked. Too wide, too practiced. "Everything okay? You look upset." Palmer forced herself to meet his eyes. "Just tired. It's been an emotional day." He moved closer, and Palmer had to resist every instinct to back away. When he reached out to touch her face, she noticed his hands were trembling slightly. "Palmer, I need to tell you something." His voice was softer now, almost vulnerable. "I know things have been difficult between us lately, but I want you to know that I love you. Whatever happens, remember that I love you." The words were so similar to what he'd said in the car before therapy that Palmer wondered if he'd practiced them. But there was something in his expression, a desperate sadness that seemed genuine. "Blake," she said carefully, "is there something you need to tell me? Something important?" For a moment, his mask slipped completely. Palmer saw fear, guilt, and something that looked like grief flash across his features. But then he pulled himself together, the practiced smile returning. "Just that I'm grateful for your patience. I know I haven't been the husband you deserve lately." After he left for another urgent call, Palmer made a decision that terrified her. She was going to search his office while he was distracted. If the real Blake was in danger, she needed to find him before it was too late. Blake's office had always been off-limits, his private space where he handled work and personal business. But nothing about their marriage was normal anymore, and Palmer was past caring about boundaries. The desk drawers were locked, but Palmer knew Blake kept a spare key taped under his desk lamp, a habit she'd always found endearingly paranoid. What she found inside made her realize Blake hadn't been paranoid enough. There were multiple identification documents, driver's licenses, social security cards, even passports for both Blake and Brendan Matthews. Birth certificates showing both twins were very much alive. And most disturbing of all, detailed notes about Palmer's daily routine, her work schedule, her friends and family members. Someone had been studying her life for months, preparing for this impersonation. The notes included details about her relationship with Blake that only someone very close to him could know. Inside jokes, intimate moments, even arguments they'd had in private. Palmer photographed everything with her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the device steady. At the bottom of the drawer, she found a burner phone with a text thread that made her blood freeze. Phase 2 complete. Wife suspects, but playing along. Ready for phase 3. Good. Eliminate the problem tonight. Make it look like an accident. What about Blake? He's no longer useful. Handle both tonight. Palmer's legs gave out, and she sank into Blake's desk chair, staring at the phone screen. They were planning to kill her. Tonight. And they were planning to kill the real Blake, too. Her phone buzzed with a call from Dr. Richardson. Palmer answered, whispering urgently, "They're going to kill us tonight. Both Blake and me. I found text messages. Palmer, where are you right now? In Blake's office. I found evidence. Fake IDs, plans, financial records. Listen to me very carefully. You need to get out of the house immediately. Don't peck anything. Don't try to confront him. Just leave. Detective Walsh is on her way to your house, but she's 20 minutes out. Palmer heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy, purposeful, different from before. He's coming back. Dr. Richardson, if something happens to me, tell them to look for Brendan Matthews. He's alive and he has my husband. Palmer ended the call and quickly replaced everything in the desk drawer, but she kept the burner phone. The footsteps were getting closer, and she realized with growing horror that they sounded different than they had all day. Heavier, more aggressive. When the fake Blake appeared in the office doorway, Palmer saw that his entire demeanor had changed. The careful, practiced facade was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. Looking for something, Palmer? His voice was the same, but the way he stood, the way he held his shoulders, even the way he looked at her was completely different. Palmer realized with terror that she might be looking at yet another person entirely. I was just looking for a pen, she said weakly. He smiled, but it was nothing like Blake's smile. It was predatory, dangerous. I think we both know that's not true. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Palmer's hand closed around the burner phone in her pocket as she realized that her nightmare was just beginning.
Palmer's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the man in the doorway, a man who looked exactly like her husband, but whose very presence now filled her with primal terror. The transformation was complete. Gone was any pretense of being Blake, replaced by someone whose cold eyes held no trace of the warmth she'd fallen in love with 7 years ago. You know, Palmer, you're much smarter than we gave you credit for, he said, stepping into the office and closing the door behind him. The soft click of the latch sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Brendan always said Blake married above his league. Palmer's breath caught. You're not Brendan. His laugh was bitter, unfamiliar. No, I'm not. Though I have to say, playing your husband has been educational. Did you know that Blake talks in his sleep? Very helpful for learning all those intimate little details that make a performance convincing. The casual cruelty in his voice made Palmer's stomach turn. Who are you? The name's Marcus Webb. I'm what you might call a specialist. Brendan hired me when his original plan started falling apart. Marcus moved closer and Palmer instinctively backed against the desk. See, twin substitution only works when the twins are actually identical in every way. But Brendan's been damaged. Prison has a way of changing a man. Prison. Palmer's mind raced. Brendan was in prison? 7 years for identity theft and fraud. Funny how that works. He went to prison for pretending to be Blake, and now he's doing it again. Though this time, the stakes are much higher. Marcus reached into his jacket, and Palmer's terror spiked, but he only pulled out a phone. His movements were casual, relaxed, like he was discussing the weather rather than describing a criminal conspiracy. The original plan was simple. Brendan gets out of prison, takes over Blake's life, transfers all the money and disappears. Clean, efficient, profitable. But Brendan underestimated how much Blake had changed, how much you'd noticed the differences. Palmer thought about all the signs she'd missed, the subtle changes in Blake's behavior over the past few months that she'd attributed to work stress. How long has this been going on? Brendan started the switch 3 months ago, just weekends at first while Blake was supposedly on business trips, but you started getting suspicious, asking too many questions. That's when Brendan called me. The room felt like it was spinning. 3 months. She'd been living with strangers for 3 months, sharing her bed, her secrets, her most vulnerable moments with people who were systematically destroying her life. Where is Blake? Palmer's voice was barely a whisper. Marcus smiled, and it was the most chilling expression Palmer had ever seen. Blake is safe. For now. But his comfort depends entirely on your cooperation. He turned his phone toward her, and Palmer's knees nearly buckled. The screen showed a video feed of Blake, the real Blake, tied to a chair in what looked like a basement. He was conscious but clearly injured, with bruises on his face and dried blood on his shirt. When he looked up at the camera, Palmer saw the man she'd married, frightened, desperate, but undeniably Blake. "Blake!" Palmer reached for the phone, but Marcus pulled it away. "He can't hear you, but he can see you." He tapped the screen, and Palmer realized with horror that this was a live feed. Somewhere, Blake was watching this conversation, helpless to intervene. "What do you want?" Palmer's voice broke. "Originally, we just wanted the money and for you to disappear quietly. But you've complicated things. Dr. Richardson, the police calls, all this investigating. You've made yourself a liability." Palmer's mind flashed to the burner phone in her pocket, to the text about eliminating the problem tonight. "You're going to kill me." That was the plan. Make it look like a murder-suicide, distraught couple, financial troubles, tragic end to a troubled marriage. But seeing how devoted you are to your husband, I think there might be a better way. Marcus moved to Blake's computer and began typing. "You're going to help us finish this. Transfer the remaining funds, sign some documents, record a video message explaining how you and Blake decided to start fresh somewhere new. Then you're going to disappear." "And if I refuse?" Marcus held up the phone again. On the screen, another figure entered the frame. Palmer recognized him immediately as Brendan, though prison had hardened his features, making him look like a cruel version of Blake. Brendan held a knife, pressing it against Blake's throat. "Blake dies. Slowly. And then we kill you anyway. But we make it hurt."
Palmer's legs gave out completely, and she slumped into the desk chair. The magnitude of her situation crashed over her. She was alone, surrounded by criminals who had been planning her death for weeks, while the man she loved was being tortured in some unknown location. "Dr. Richardson knows," Palmer said desperately. "She called the police. They're coming." Marcus checked his watch. "Detective Walsh? She's been delayed." Amazing how a fake emergency call about a multi-car accident can tie up resources. "We have at least an hour." Palmer's last hope crumbled. Even her allies had been neutralized. "Now," Marcus said, pulling up their banking website, "let's start with that savings account. You're going to transfer the remaining $8,000 to this account number." Palmer stared at the screen, her mind frantically searching for options. If she complied, she and Blake would die anyway. If she refused, Blake would die immediately. There had to be another choice, but she couldn't see it. "Palmer," Marcus's voice was patient but menacing, "I need an answer. Cooperate, and Blake lives a little longer. Refuse, and watch him die right now." On the phone screen, Brendan pressed the knife harder against Blake's throat. A thin line of blood appeared, and Blake's eyes widened with pain and terror. "Stop!" Palmer lunged for the computer. "I'll do it. Just don't hurt him." As Palmer's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her training as a counselor kicked in. She'd worked with hostage situations before, domestic violence cases where victims were trapped with no apparent escape. The key was to buy time, to look for opportunities, to never give up hope entirely. "This account number," Palmer said, stalling. "Whose is it?" "Doesn't matter. I need to verify it's correct. If I transfer to the wrong account, the money could be lost forever." Marcus showed her a piece of paper with banking information. Palmer memorized the account number and routing details, evidence she could provide to police if she survived this. As she began typing, Palmer became aware of sounds outside. A car door slamming, footsteps on the front walkway. Marcus heard it too, his body tensing. "Expecting someone?" His hand moved inside his jacket again. Palmer's heart leapt. Could Dr. Richardson have found a way to get help here faster? But then she heard voices. Multiple male voices, coordination and confidence that suggested these weren't rescuers. "Right on time," Marcus said with satisfaction. "My associates are here to help with the cleanup." Palmer realized with dawning horror that this wasn't a rescue. It was the arrival of accomplices who would help stage their deaths. The black sedan she'd noticed earlier hadn't been surveillance. It had been backup. The front door opened without anyone knocking, confirming that these people had keys, had been planning this invasion for some time. Heavy footsteps moved through the house below, and Palmer heard furniture being moved, equipment being set up. "They're preparing the scene," Marcus explained conversationally. When the police eventually find your bodies, everything will point to a tragic domestic situation. Blake's financial troubles, your marital problems, the stress of therapy, it all builds a perfect narrative. Palmer closed her eyes, trying to center herself. In her work, she'd seen people survive impossible situations through courage, quick thinking, and refusing to give up hope. She had advantages these criminals didn't know about. The burner phone in her pocket, her knowledge of their real identities, her understanding of their timeline. But she also had something more powerful. The absolute determination to save Blake and herself no matter what it cost. When Palmer opened her eyes, she saw Marcus watching her with interest. "You're not going to break, are you? I can see why Blake fell in love with you. You're much stronger than you appear." Palmer met his gaze steadily. "You have no idea how strong I am." For the first time since this nightmare began, Palmer felt something other than fear. She felt anger. Pure, focused rage at these people who had violated her life, stolen her security, and threatened the man she loved. Marcus might think he held all the cards, but Palmer was about to show him that a woman fighting for her life was the most dangerous opponent he could ever face.
Palmer's transformation from victim to fighter happened in the space of a heartbeat. As she stared at Marcus Webb's smug expression, something fundamental shifted inside her. She'd spent months feeling guilty about her marriage failing, questioning her own perceptions, doubting her instincts. But now, with absolute clarity, she understood that she'd done nothing wrong. She'd been systematically gaslit, manipulated, and terrorized by criminals who'd invaded every aspect of her life. And Palmer Matthews was done being afraid. "You know what I find interesting, Marcus?" Palmer said, her voice steady for the first time in hours. "You've made a crucial mistake." Marcus raised an eyebrow, amused. "Really? And what's that?" Palmer stood up slowly, using the movement to discreetly activate the voice recording app on her phone in her pocket. "You assume that because I'm scared, I'm helpless. But I'm a trained crisis counselor. I've worked with domestic violence victims, hostage situations, and psychological trauma for years. I know exactly what you're doing, and more importantly, I know how to fight back." The amusement in Marcus's eyes flickered. "Fighting back isn't really an option at this point, Palmer." "Isn't it?" Palmer moved toward the window, forcing Marcus to turn his back to the door. "Let me tell you what I've learned about criminals like you. You're good at planning, excellent at manipulation, but you always underestimate your victims. You see us as props in your story rather than people with our own intelligence and resources." From downstairs, Palmer could hear the associates moving around, but their footsteps were casual, unhurried. They thought they had all the time in the world. "For instance," Palmer continued, "you think you've neutralized Dr. Richardson and the police. But what you don't know is that Dr. Richardson isn't just a therapist. She's a former FBI behavioral analyst who left the bureau to focus on family counseling. And Detective Walsh isn't just any detective. She's the lead investigator on a task force specifically targeting twin substitution schemes." This last part was a complete fabrication, but Palmer saw uncertainty flash across Marcus's features. In crisis counseling, she'd learned that introducing doubt into an attacker's confidence could create crucial seconds of hesitation. "You're bluffing," Marcus said, but his hand moved toward his phone. "Am I? Tell me, Marcus, when you researched Dr. Richardson's background, did you dig deep enough to find her FBI credentials? Did you check Detective Walsh's specializations? Or did you just assume you were dealing with small-town professionals who wouldn't recognize a sophisticated operation?" Palmer was making it up as she went, but years of reading micro-expressions told her she was hitting home. Marcus was checking his phone, probably trying to verify information about Dr. Richardson. "And here's another thing you didn't consider," Palmer pressed her advantage. "Blake and I have been in marriage counseling for weeks. Dr. Richardson has detailed documentation of behavioral changes, inconsistencies, everything that proves the man sitting in her office wasn't my husband. Even if you kill us both tonight, the evidence trail is already established." Marcus's confidence was cracking. Palmer could see him reassessing, realizing that what he thought was a contained situation might be much more complicated. But none of that matters, Palmer said, moving closer to him with calculated boldness, because you're not going to kill anyone tonight. Really? And how do you figure that? Palmer smiled, and for the first time in this entire nightmare, it was genuine. 30 minutes ago, I sent a text message to my sister Emma with a code word we established years ago for emergencies. By now, she's already contacted the FBI field office in Hartford, the state police, and probably our local SWAT team. This last part was a complete fabrication, but Palmer saw Marcus dart toward his phone again. The truth was, Palmer's sister Emma was probably asleep in her apartment in Boston, completely unaware of the drama unfolding in Connecticut. But Marcus didn't know that. You're lying, Marcus said, but doubt was creeping into his voice. Am I? Tell me, Marcus. The code word is anniversary. Emma knows that if I ever text her that word, it means I'm in immediate mortal danger, and she should contact every law enforcement agency she can think of. It's a system we set up after she went through her own domestic violence situation 3 years ago. This part was actually true. Palmer and Emma did have an emergency code system, though Palmer had never used it, but the specific details made her lie more convincing. From downstairs, Palmer heard a phone ringing. One of the associates answered it, and Palmer caught fragments of an urgent conversation. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone suggested complications. Marcus was listening too, his attention divided. Palmer used the moment to inch closer to Blake's desk, where she'd spotted something that could change everything. Blake's emergency radio, the one he kept for power outages and natural disasters. If she could reach it without Marcus noticing...
Even if what you're saying is true, Marcus said, trying to regain control, it doesn't matter. We have Blake, we have you, and we can be gone long before any cavalry arrives. Can you? Palmer challenged. Because I'm betting your escape plan didn't account for multiple law enforcement agencies converging on this location. And here's something else you didn't consider. This neighborhood has an active community watch program. Mrs. Henderson across the street is probably already on the phone with police about the suspicious black sedan that's been sitting there all day. Palmer was thinking of their elderly neighbor who was notorious for calling the police about everything from loud music to suspicious delivery trucks. If anyone would have noticed unusual activity, it would be Mrs. Henderson. Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and Palmer saw his expression change. Whatever message he'd received wasn't good news. Problems? Palmer asked sweetly. Instead of answering, he called down to his associates. Change of plans. We're leaving in 5 minutes. Palmer's heart leapt. Whatever was happening, it was disrupting their timeline. But she also knew that desperate criminals were often more dangerous than confident ones. You know what the real irony is, Marcus? Palmer said, slowly reaching toward the radio while maintaining eye contact. You thought you were so clever planning this whole elaborate scheme, but you made the same mistake every criminal makes. You underestimated your victim. Her fingers brushed the radio's power switch. I am not a victim, Palmer said firmly. I am a survivor, and I am done being afraid of you. With one swift motion, Palmer switched on the emergency radio and immediately tuned it to the emergency broadcast frequency. The radio crackled to life, filling the room with static. Marcus lunged for her, but Palmer was ready. Years of self-defense classes she had taken after working with domestic violence clients kicked in. She grabbed Blake's heavy glass paperweight from the desk and swung it at Marcus's reaching hand. The impact made Marcus cry out and stumble backward. Palmer used the precious seconds to speak into the radio's microphone. Emergency, emergency. This is Palmer Matthews at 142 Elm Street in Westfield. Multiple armed intruders, kidnapping in progress. Requesting immediate police and FBI assistance. From downstairs, Palmer heard shouting, running footsteps, and what sounded like equipment being hastily packed. The associates were clearly preparing to abandon the operation. Marcus managed to wrestle the radio away from Palmer, but as he did, she grabbed the burner phone from his jacket pocket. The one with all the incriminating text messages. Give me that, Marcus demanded. No, Palmer said, backing toward the door.
This phone contains evidence of conspiracy, kidnapping, and attempted murder. You want it? Come and take it. For the first time since this nightmare began, Palmer felt like she was in control. She had evidence, she'd disrupted their timeline, and most importantly, she had found her voice. The frightened, confused woman who had sat in Dr. Richardson's office just hours ago was gone, replaced by someone who refused to be a victim. Marcus advanced on her, but Palmer was already moving, phone in hand, ready to run, fight, or do whatever it took to save Blake and herself. The turning point had arrived, and Palmer Matthews was no longer the same woman who had made breakfast for a stranger that morning. She was someone who fought back.
Palmer clutched the burner phone containing the incriminating evidence as chaos erupted around her. Marcus lunged for the device, but Palmer was already moving, her years of self-defense training finally put to deadly serious use. She feinted left, then spun right, using Blake's office door as a barrier between herself and her attacker. "You have nowhere to run, Palmer," Marcus shouted, but she could hear the desperation in his voice. The careful professional facade had cracked completely, revealing someone who'd lost control of his operation. From downstairs came the sound of heavy equipment being dragged across floors. Urgent voices coordinated a hasty evacuation. Palmer's emergency broadcast had clearly rattled the entire team, but she also knew that cornered criminals were at their most dangerous. Palmer's mind raced through her options. The house's layout gave her some advantages. She knew every creaky floorboard, every hiding spot, every exit route. But the associates downstairs blocked the main entrances, and Marcus was between her and the window. Then Palmer remembered something that made her heart leap with hope. Last month, Blake had insisted on installing a panic room communication system in their bedroom closet, a direct line to emergency services that he'd claimed was standard security for executives. At the time, Palmer had thought it was paranoid. Now she realized it might save their lives. Palmer broke for the bedroom, Marcus close behind her. She could hear his heavy breathing, his muttered curses, as he pursued her through the house that had been her sanctuary just hours ago. The familiar hallway felt like a gauntlet, but Palmer pushed forward with single-minded determination. In the bedroom, Palmer dove for the closet, frantically pushing aside clothes to reach the hidden panel Blake had shown her. Marcus grabbed her ankle, trying to drag her away, but Palmer kicked back hard, connecting with something solid. Marcus's grip loosened with a cry of pain. Palmer's fingers found the concealed switch, and a small panel slid open, revealing a secure communication device. She activated it immediately. "Emergency services. This is an active kidnapping and attempted murder at 142 Elm Street, Westfield. Multiple armed suspects, one victim being held at unknown location. FBI involvement is required. This is connected to interstate identity theft and fraud." "Ma'am, units are already en route to your location. Are you in immediate danger?" "Yes," Palmer gasped as Marcus appeared in the closet doorway. "Suspect is pursuing me now. Need immediate assistance." Marcus held up his hands in apparent surrender, but Palmer didn't trust the gesture. "Palmer, listen to me. This has gone too far. Let's work something out. I can take you to Blake." "Where is he?" Palmer demanded, keeping the communication line open so emergency services could hear everything. "About 20 minutes from here. An old warehouse in Hartford. But if you don't come with me willingly, Brendan will kill him the moment we don't check in on schedule." Palmer's heart clenched, but her training kicked in. In hostage situations, kidnappers always used the victim as leverage. The key was not to let emotion override strategy. "How do I know Blake is even still alive?" she challenged. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her the live video feed. Blake was still tied to the chair, but he was moving, trying to work his hands free from the ropes. Seeing him fighting, even in captivity, gave Palmer strength. "He's alive," Marcus said, "but not for long if we don't resolve this situation." Through the communication device, Palmer heard a voice say, Mrs. Matthews, this is Detective Susan Walsh with Hartford PD. We've traced the video signal your suspect is showing you. Technical teams are moving toward that location now. Palmer's relief was overwhelming. Dr. Richardson had been right. Detective Walsh was real, and she was already working the case. Marcus's face went white as he realized his leverage was evaporating. That's impossible. You're bluffing. Mrs. Matthews, Detective Walsh continued over the comm, we need you to keep the suspect talking for another 3 minutes while our teams get into position at both locations. Palmer understood. She needed to stall, to keep Marcus from contacting Brendan and potentially getting Blake killed in a panic. Marcus, Palmer said, surprising him by using his name. This doesn't have to end with anyone else getting hurt. You're obviously intelligent, skilled at what you do. This operation just went sideways, but that doesn't mean you can't walk away. Walk away? Marcus laughed bitterly. Do you have any idea how much planning went into this? How much money we've already invested? Tell me, Palmer said, genuinely curious. How does something like this even start? Marcus seemed almost relieved to have someone to talk to, someone who wasn't immediately trying to arrest or attack him. Brendan contacted us 2 years ago, while he was still in prison. He'd been obsessing about his brother, about the life Blake had built while he was locked up. The resentment had been eating at him for years. Palmer listened, keeping one eye on Marcus and the other on his phone where Blake was still visible on the screen. At first, it was supposed to be simple. Switch places for a few weeks, drain the accounts, disappear. But Blake had changed so much since Brendan went to prison. Different habits, different mannerisms, different everything. That's when Brendan realized he needed professional help.
I specialize in long-term impersonation, corporate espionage mostly. But the money Brendan offered, Marcus shrugged. It was supposed to be a quick job. Study Blake for a few weeks, coach Brendan on the differences, make the switch seamless. But I started noticing things. You're much more perceptive than we anticipated. Brendan was convinced he could fool you indefinitely, but you kept catching inconsistencies. That's when we decided I needed to take over the impersonation entirely. Palmer was horrified. How long were you in my house? In my bed? Marcus looked uncomfortable for the first time. I want you to know that I kept things professional. I slept on the couch, claimed I had back problems. I know this probably doesn't matter to you, but I'm not a monster. The distinction felt meaningless to Palmer, but she used his obvious discomfort to press forward. Where did Brendan go wrong? What turned him into someone who could kidnap his own brother? Prison changes people. But honestly, I think the resentment started much earlier. Brendan was always the troublemaker. Blake was always the golden child. When they were kids, Blake got the praise, the opportunities, the clean record. Brendan got detention, juvenile court, eventually prison. Palmer thought about the happy family photos she'd seen at Blake's parents' house, the stories Blake had told about his childhood. There had never been any mention of a troubled twin brother. Blake doesn't even know about me, Marcus said, as if reading her thoughts. The family cut ties with Brendan years ago. They told Blake his brother died in that motorcycle accident, made him believe he was an only child. They thought they were protecting him. The tragedy of the situation hit Palmer suddenly. 2 brothers, separated by choices and circumstances, now locked in a conflict that could destroy them both. Mrs. Matthews, Detective Walsh's voice came through the comm. We're in position. Teams are moving on both locations simultaneously. Palmer heard it then, the sound she'd been praying for. Police sirens, multiple vehicles, getting closer by the second. Marcus heard them too. His face went through a series of expressions: defeat, anger, and finally, resignation. It's over, Palmer said softly. Marcus nodded slowly, then did something unexpected. He held out his phone to Palmer. Tell Blake, tell him I'm sorry. This wasn't personal. Before Palmer could respond, the house exploded with activity. The front door burst open and tactical officers flooded in, shouting commands. Marcus raised his hands and allowed himself to be cuffed without resistance. Through the chaos, Palmer heard Detective Walsh's voice. "Blake Matthews has been recovered alive. He's injured but stable. Brendan Matthews and 2 associates are in custody." Palmer's legs gave out, and she sank to the bedroom's floor, overwhelmed with relief. It was over. Blake was alive. They were both safe. 2 hours later, Palmer stood in the Hartford General Hospital corridor, watching through a window as doctors examined Blake. His injuries looked worse than they were, mostly bruises and dehydration from his ordeal. But he was awake, alert, and asking for her. When the doctors finally let her in, Blake's first words were not what she expected. "Palmer, I am so sorry. I should have told you about Brendan years ago. I should have protected you from this." Palmer took his hand, his left hand, with his watch on the right wrist where it belonged, and felt the familiar warmth that had been missing for months. "Blake, you couldn't have known. Your family thought they were protecting you. But you figured it out. You saved us both." Palmer squeezed his hand. "We saved each other. But Blake, we have a lot to talk about. A lot to rebuild." "I know. Our whole marriage, the last few months, were stolen from us. But that doesn't mean we can't get them back. That doesn't mean we can't start again." Dr. Richardson appeared in the doorway, her professional composure replaced by obvious relief. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to check on you both. Palmer, what you did tonight was extraordinary." "I just used what you taught me about trusting my instincts, about not letting others gaslight me into doubting what I knew to be true." "And what do you know to be true now?" Palmer looked at Blake, really looked at him, seeing all the small details that made him uniquely himself. The tiny scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle way he held her hand as if she were precious. "I know that love is worth fighting for. I know that I'm stronger than I ever imagined, and I know that sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up showing you exactly who you're meant to become." 6 months later, Palmer and Blake renewed their wedding vows in a small ceremony attended only by family and close friends. Dr. Richardson officiated, and in her remarks, she spoke about the difference between a marriage built on assumption and one built on conscious choice. Palmer wore the same dress she'd worn to their original wedding, but everything else was different. They were different. Stronger, more honest, more intentionally committed to building something real together. As they exchanged rings again, Palmer thought about the woman who had made breakfast for a stranger that cold morning months ago. That woman had been living in a comfortable illusion, trusting without questioning, loving without truly seeing. The woman standing at this altar was someone who had faced the worst and emerged not bitter, but wiser. Not broken, but transformed. And when Blake, the real Blake, promised to love, honor, and cherish her for the rest of their lives, Palmer knew with absolute certainty that he meant every word. Because this time, she knew exactly who she was marrying. And more importantly, she knew exactly who she was herself. A woman who would never again allow anyone to make her doubt her own truth, her own strength, or her own worth. The marriage that began again that day was built on a foundation that could weather any storm. Complete honesty, hard-won trust, and the unshakable knowledge that they had both chosen each other with their eyes wide open. Some stories end with the revelation of truth. Palmer's story began with it.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.